No one intends to build their faith on myths, urban legends, or folk religions. But many of us were handed falsehoods about what Jesus or the scriptures teach by well-meaning people who had also been handed these falsehoods. Parents, grandparents, pastors, friends. Often bad ideas and beliefs even work for us until life proves that they don't. The sad result is frequently a spiritual disaster, confusion, feelings of betrayal, a distrust in scripture, loss of faith, or even anger towards both the church and God. But it doesn't have to be this way. What if we confronted some of these falsehoods? What if we chose to see what Jesus had to say about some of these widely held beliefs that can become dangerous? What if we decided to put an end to bad religion?
We have family friends. They're my parents' age, and so I see them a few times a year usually. Oftentimes they're on the holidays when my wife and kids and I, we travel to Texas to visit with my parents, and we often see these family friends. And a lot of times we see them in a group setting, so it'll be them and a number of other different couples that my parents have been friends with for a number of years. And usually at some point during the conversation, the topic of your kids and how your kids are doing comes up, and they're all a little bit older, so their kids are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond at this point. And my parents' friends, this particular set, I notice that whenever that subject gets raised, there's just a tension that they feel around it. They get kind of quiet and reserved, and they basically decide, like, I'm not going to probably have anything to say around this particular item, because while lots of their friends, they're talking about their kids doing well and going on to jobs and marrying people and doing all kinds of things, they know that of their 3 children, only one of them is on a good path, and the other 2, one has been in and out of rehab facilities for the last decade, and there's really no sign that that's going to change anytime soon. The other child has just been listless, just kind of bounced from one job to the other, hasn't found that career path, and then a few years ago got into a debate, an argument with his parents, and he decided that he wasn't going to speak to them anymore. So they've reached out to him numbers of times, but they have no relationship with him, and he's completely unresponsive at this point. So 3 kids they have, a daughter, 2 sons, all 3 raised in the same household with the exact same parents and the exact same values and really the exact same parenting style. And yet one of them decided to commit their life to Jesus fairly early on and has lived a life really marked by faithfulness and by vocation. She's a leader in her household, in her church, in her company. And the other 2 have struggled. And so these friends of my parents, when they stand around with all these other parents and the subject of how your kids are doing, you can just tell that they feel like they failed, or they feel like if they had maybe done something differently, then their kids would have been okay. And not only that, but they know that they have friends who also think it's their fault that 2 of their kids have had a difficult journey into adulthood. And so they just kind of clam up and they get quiet. Over the last several weeks, we've been looking at a series called Bad Religion, stupid things that smart Christians believe. And as a reminder, I have personally believed every one of these things at some point in my life. So I'm not trying to pick on anybody. But the things we've looked at so far are this false idea that faith can fix anything, or the false idea that everything happens for a reason, or the false idea that God has a blueprint for my life. And we've talked through that Scripture doesn't affirm any of these 3, and in fact says something rather different about all 3. So if these are things that you've held to or that you've been challenged by, I would encourage you maybe to go back and listen to the last 3 weeks. I won't spend a lot of time recapping today. And today we just want to talk about this idea that a godly home guarantees godly kids. And a lot of you who are listening to this are parents or are looking to be parents. Some of you are not. And I just want you to know that regardless of which category you fall into, I think that there's something in here for you today. But we have this belief that if we just could create the right home environment, if we could set things just the right way, a certain way, then our kids would get on a certain trajectory, and essentially we'd have made an investment in them, and that there will be a guaranteed return on that investment, that a godly home guarantees godly kids. But I think this is actually a misguided belief and actually a dangerous belief. And so I want to talk through why we believe it, why it's misguided, what the dangers are, and a different way to think about it. So why do we believe it? Well, as we've said a couple times throughout this series, we really want explanations that make sense of the data and that are emotionally satisfying. And so it's emotionally satisfying to believe that regardless of how my kids are doing right now, my 3-year-old, my 4-year-old, my 5-year-old, if I just continue to invest and lead them in the right direction, then they'll end up being okay. That is really emotionally satisfying, because here's the problem. Parenting is hard. Like, it's really hard. And if you've never done it, you may have seen other people doing it and thought to yourself, I'm not doing that. Because it is pretty difficult. In fact, a pastor, a friend of mine, Larry Osborne at North Coast Church, just north of San Diego, he said that he used to have titles for his sermons before he had kids were very certain about how to raise godly kids. But then he started having kids, and then the longer he had kids, the less certain his sermon titles around family and parenting became. So he started off with like 10 rules for raising godly kids. And then after he had children, he changed it more to like 10 guidelines for raising good kids. Like, that's close. And he had a few years pass by, and it was like 5 principles for raising kids. And then finally, 3 suggestions for surviving parenthood, right? Like we just worked all the way through. And so parenting is difficult. And we want some assurance that for all of our trouble and for all of our input, like, things will turn out okay. In 2013, my wife and I had our first child, and I know that she is thrilled that this is the picture I chose to use of the two of us today, but I also want to point out that I was wearing face masks way before it was cool. So I'm here with my wife, Emily, and my son, Jack, and she had to have a C-section done, and because he had flipped in the womb like 1 week before his due date, and they had mashed on her belly to try to get him to flip around. But honestly, he has just been a lot of trouble ever since 1 week before he was born. So he wouldn't flip. So she had to do C-section. So I got called in, and I had to sit on this side of the curtain while they have sliced her belly up on the other side of this curtain. And they told me I could look, and I tried that for a minute. And so this was, her head side was over here, and then the cadaver side of her was on the other side of this cloth. And so this is a picture of the good side. And then they had to sew her back up. So they hand me this baby, and then they walk me down to our hospital room. It's kind of like a holding room we'll be in for just a little while they sew her back up. And they tell me, sit down and hold him. And then they just left me there, completely unsupervised by other adults with a child. No idea what I'm doing. And I just remember the weight of like, there's no one to hold this responsibility but me and Emily now. It's on us. And they didn't give me a manual on how to operate this kid. They showed me like 3 videos about how not to shake him. So I was like, okay, I'll not shake him. Like, I can do that much at least. But it was the enormous amount of responsibility. And then her parents came, and my parents came, and they hung out and held Jack for the very first time. And they were there for like a couple of weeks. They came, stayed with us, helped us like make grocery runs to the store. We, helped us with feedings in the middle of the night, and just got everything that they could do to pitch in. It was fantastic. And then they just left us with a baby. and I just remember feeling like this is kind of hard. And having to figure it out as we would go. And then babies change. So the way you parent when they're a month old actually has to change by the time they're 3 months old. And by the time they're a year, you have to learn a totally different set of parenting skills. So every time I would learn how to parent my kid, he would become a completely different kid. and it became exhausting. And not only that, but before we had children, we were just super judgy. We didn't realize it at the time, but we'd be walking down the aisles of Costco or Target, and we'd see a kid throwing a temper tantrum, and we'd be like, those parents, right? Oh, can you believe it? And then we had a kid, and we're like, they come pre-programmed for tantrums. Okay, that makes more sense. And then we have 2 kids, and they're lovely, lovely children. This is Jack, and this is William, and this was Gingerbread Houses back in December. So Jack, it turns out, just as a child, just genetically, he's predisposed to be very agreeable. He is the kindest, most polite. He's an encourager. And so we had Jack. By the time he was 3 or 4 years old, Emily and I were like, we are phenomenal parents. Look how good we are at this. And then we had another child. And he was different. On a scale of agreeable to disagreeable, Jack is hyper agreeable. And on a scale of agreeable to disagreeable, William is the opposite of that. So, I could just, Jack would do something he's not supposed to do, and I'm like, hey, bud, that's not cool. Don't do that. And he's like, oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. Like, Dad, are we okay? Like, you forgive me? Like, Jack, it's okay, bud. You're okay. If I tell William, like, hey, bud, that's not so cool, William's like, it is cool. I think it's really cool. What's wrong with you? Like, that's the difference in these kids. And you know what? I'm very excited to parent both of them, because as many challenges as there are to parenting 2 kids who are very, very different, I'm so excited to see how they're going to grow up. and Jack is always going to be one of the most encouraging people in the room. That's just who he is. William, though, has such strength and such imagination. He is so good at figuring out the loophole to not do the thing he's supposed to do. And he thinks of it instantly. Like, he takes no time to think of whatsoever. A few years ago, he said a bad word at the dinner table. And I don't even know, well, I actually do. He heard it from a friend. Who I will not name. So he heard it from a friend. He said it at the dinner table, and he used it appropriately at the age of 3. And I was like, you shouldn't say that. Also, it's kind of impressive that you use it in the right context. So, no, don't do that. And then we're like, don't say that word. And he's like, but I can say it at the house, just not in front. I was like, no, just don't say it anywhere. And before I almost finished the sentence, he said, but I can say it in my room when no one's listening. And I said, no, you can't. I know everything you do, which is not going to age well, probably. But that was kind of the conversation. He is so creative with that kind of stuff, which means, you know what? One day, he has the opportunity to be some kind of creative entrepreneur or a great leader or an inmate at a prison. I don't know. But we'll see how it goes. Parenting is hard. And you do the best you can. And then just the reality is, sometimes the best you can seems to produce a child that is focused on Christ and on making the world a better place, and in giving something of themselves for the sake of others. That's a beautiful thing. But sometimes it doesn't end that way. And the thing is, we desperately want assurance that everything is going to be okay. We want assurance. Like, by the time you've literally given years of your life to somebody in hopes that they'll get on a good path because you love them, because you care about them, you just want some assurance that it's going to be okay. And so we believe this idea that a godly home guarantees godly kids because we desperately want it to be true. In addition to that, we find a proverb, Proverbs 22:6, that seems to maybe indicate that it would be true. In this verse, I've heard quoted many times over the course of my life. I've grown up in churches, so if you're newer to church, first of all, welcome. So excited that you're here. It's maybe totally unfamiliar to you, and that's totally fine. But for me, and for probably a number of others who are here today, you've probably heard this at some point. And here's the verse, Proverbs 22:6. Start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it. Now, the problem is that this is a proverb, but we've treated it as a promise. But those two things are different. So why do we believe it? Well, we believe it because parenting is hard. It's emotionally satisfying and assuring to believe that a godly home creates godly kids. We believe it because we have this verse, and for many of us, we've heard this read to us out of context or taken as a promise rather than a proverb. But here's why it's misguided. This verse is a great verse, but we just need to understand what a proverb is. A proverb is a short, pithy saying stating a general truth or piece of advice. It's not meant to be a promise, which means that a proverb is something that is generally true. There are other proverbs throughout the book of Proverbs that we find in the Hebrew Bible and our Old Testament. There are other proverbs that we could recognize instantly are generally true, but not always true. There are proverbs, for instance, about how the wicked will suffer and the righteous will flourish. There are proverbs about that. But all of us know stories where the wicked are prospering and the righteous are suffering. In fact, the New Testament shows us the most righteous of all time, Jesus, suffered. So we recognize that these are principles that are generally true, but not always true. And even within the United States, we have little short proverbs, sayings that are generally true. But if we put them back to back, they actually contradict one another. For instance, you've probably heard the proverb that opposites attract. And you've also probably heard the proverb that birds of a feather flock together. Well, which one is it? Right? They're both generally true, but they're also opposing to each other. The early bird gets the worm, but also haste makes waste. Okay, so hurry up and stop, I guess. I don't know how to take that really. Clothes make the man, but also you can't judge a book by its cover. Right? Those things we would say, well, yeah, this both can be true. Great minds think alike, but also fools seldom differ. So if you and I agree on something, we're either geniuses or idiots. That's kind of the way that goes. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, but also out of sight, out of mind. Right? There's these proverbs that are like generally true, but they're not a promise. So what we need to see is that this passage in Proverbs is not promising you that if you set a child on the right course, that child will never depart from it. That's not a promise. Rather, it's saying that the best thing you can do is to set a child on the right course, and then hopefully, generally speaking, they will continue on that right course even as they get into adulthood. It's not a promise, but it is still a good practice. So that's what the proverb is teaching. So if that's what it's teaching, like what is the danger of misunderstanding that, of misreading that? Why is this something that we actually decided to spend a whole week on out of this Bad Religion series? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, one of the dangers is unnecessary guilt and shame. I've been a pastor for nearly 20 years now, and I have sat down with probably a couple hundred at least parents over that time to hear about their struggles with their child or with their family life or with one another. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat with a couple that said, you know what? We took our kids to church every time the doors were open. We read devotionals at night. We prayed. We tried to model for them this way of Jesus. And my kids have left the church now. Or my kids don't know what they think about faith now. Or my kids are addicted to this, or they're into that, or they've gotten together with this group of people, and that group is shaping them far more than their upbringing did. Like we're just at a loss. We don't know what to do. And here's the question: where did we go wrong? Now look, if you're a parent, you know that no parents are perfect. And if you are a son or a daughter of a parent, you definitely know that no parents are perfect. But sometimes we place all the weight for the decisions of our children on our own shoulders, when that's never been your responsibility to bear. We all make mistakes. None of us are perfect. But the hope is that we really invest in our kids, that we really put aside our own kind of selfishness for a season while we raise these children and really put them first. Not ahead of our own health, emotional well-being, like we can't be there for them if we don't do that, but that we really put their desires before our own just desires. And I had no idea how selfish I was before I had kids. It was when there was the constant, like I can't tell you how many Pixar films we've had to watch over the last several years, and how many little side attractions we've had to go. When we go on vacation, like the places we go, like they're not places that Emily and I would ever choose if we didn't have kids, right? We're going to children's fair stuff and children's science museums and all this stuff. But they are learning and growing, and they love this stuff and being able to watch them. Like I used to love just going to the movie theater and watching 2 or 3 movies in a row. I haven't done that in years. And that's a small thing that I gave up for my kids. I used to love sleeping. That was fun. I remember what that was. I gave that up for my kids. I used to love date nights. And while we still make we make sure that we do that, we try to do that at least once a month or several times a month if things are open and COVID's not a thing. We used to do it all the time. And so you just have to rearrange your priorities, your schedule, your desires, your everything. There are things that you'd like to do or buy or be that you really can't because you're called to be a parent. And so, like, all of us have to give that to our kids for sure. But the thing is, like, no matter how much of ourselves that we give, and no matter how much we invest in trying to get them on the right path and trying to help them develop and all those kinds of things, there will come a point where your child develops enough autonomy that they will be making their own decisions completely independent of you. And at some point, we just have to acknowledge that it's time to let go. And for some of you, your parents never learned to let go. And you carry that with you all the time, and it became an area of contention in your relationship. It's the letting go thing and recognizing I've done what I can at this point. I'm still here for you, but I can't make your decisions for you. And if you never get to that place, you just feel this guilt and shame like, well, but I was promised a godly home would equal godly kids. And since my kids aren't going toward godliness right now, it must be all my fault. And look, I think all of us should do some introspection and determine whether we were the parents that we should have been, that God called us to be. Yes, please do that. I'm not trying to give a total pass and say, whatever you do, it doesn't matter at all. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like, do your best. And then leave the results to God. Because you can't make their decisions for them. And if you think that this is just an investment that you make and get an automatic return, then you'll start to believe that you did something terribly wrong, even if you didn't. There's guilt and shame that comes with that. On the flip side of this, by the way, there's foolish pride. There's foolish pride. This idea that, you know what, my kids turned out great, and so I must be amazing. And you just never had a child maybe that was really hard like some other parents had, or maybe your children just ended up making great choices, and by the grace of God that happened. But you don't want to have this foolish pride that believes like, you know what, if every parent were just more like me, then every child would turn out fantastic. And so you can go, two sides of the same coin, basically. Foolish pride on the one side and unnecessary guilt and shame on the other can also give you false hope. For some people, they've read that Proverbs passage as like, well, even if my kids depart, they'll come back later. Or my kids won't depart. They just won't do it because I created a godly environment. I taught them in the way that they should go. And so it creates this false hope. And if that hope ever gets dashed, the result can be anger with God. We said this a few weeks ago, but anger is just unmet expectations plus fear. Is there anything more personal to us than the well-being of our children? Like when our expectations of how they would grow up aren't met, that just naturally makes us fearful. We long so badly for them to go down the right path. And so if that doesn't happen, we just find ourselves with this anger toward God. So this is why I say this is an important topic, because I don't want you to be unnecessarily hopeless, unnecessarily guilty, unnecessarily prideful, or unnecessarily angry with God. I don't want to see those things happen for you. I think that's bad for you. It's bad for your spiritual journey. It's bad for your health. So how do we think about it differently? Well, if you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to turn to the book of Ephesians with me. We're going to be in chapter number 6. And if you want to, we'll have it up on the screen as well. If you're following along at home, you can look digital Bible or paper Bible, whatever you got with you. But Ephesians chapter number 6. And we're going to look at this passage that's written by the Apostle Paul. Paul was one of the very first leaders in the Christian church. He wrote a good chunk of the New Testament. So the majority of the life application, that Jesus' teaching turned into life application that is in the New Testament, is written by the Apostle Paul. He really helps people understand how to apply the things that Jesus called us to our average, normal, everyday, ordinary life. And so in Ephesians, he ends toward the end of his letter to the church in Ephesus. He begins talking to them about what it looks like to apply this to their households. And he begins by talking to children. And this wouldn't have been surprising at all. He says this in Ephesians 6:1. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother." And that's a quote from the 10 Commandments that were given to Moses in the Hebrew Scriptures. He says, "Honor your father and mother," which is the first commandment with a promise, "so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." Now, some cynical scholars have said that the reason this command included a promise, honor your father and mother so that you may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth, is because that, 2,000-3,000 years ago, if you didn't honor your father and mother, they might just kill you. So honor them so that you can live longer than that, right? Like that might be the reason for the promise attached to it. But either way, the commandment was given to honor your father and your mother. Now, it wouldn't have been surprising at all that in rules on the household, application for the household, that the Apostle Paul immediately talks to children, because children were on the lowest rung of the social ladder in first century, like in the Roman Empire. They were just absolutely the lowest. Children were seen as property. Like they had no rights. So you may remember the story where Jesus is talking to people and this group of children runs up to him. And the apostles try to block it off. They're like, no, children, Jesus doesn't have time for you. You should go away. And Jesus says, no, let the children come to me. Let all the children gather around here, because unless you become like one of these children, you will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, the way that I've often heard that translated is this idea that like, oh, children are so innocent and sweet, and like we need to become innocent and childlike, and we need to have that childlike faith that just believes anything. No. What Jesus was pointing out is that these children have no social status. These children have nothing. They're wholly dependent upon their parents for life and support. And what he's saying in the mix of this group of people, these people who considered themselves very religiously devout, these people who had gained high status because of their religious devotion, they'd climbed up through the Jewish religious social ladder. He's essentially saying, look, regardless of how much clout you think you have, regardless of how many material possessions that you own, unless you start to see yourself like these children, unless you start to recognize that in the eyes of God, you have no status, you are wholly dependent on him, he is the one who created and sustains you, then you can't come into the kingdom of God. So let these children who are so looked down upon by society, who have no status, let them come to me, because I am not here for those with status. I am here for those who are willing to lose their status in order to follow after the creator of the universe. And so it's not surprising that Paul gave a command to children, because children had all the obligation. Children were obligated to obey their parents, and the parents weren't really obligated to the children, because no one is obligated to the children. Except in the next verse, Paul flips this idea on its head and says this: fathers, because remember, he's writing to a patriarchal society. So the fathers were the heads of the household. That's just the way the society was built. We could say fathers and mothers. That's not the way that our society functions. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. In other words, children, you have an obligation to your parents. Hey, dads, moms, those of you who in this moment in history would not necessarily be obligated by society to your kids, you have an obligation too. Don't exasperate them. Which, by the way, as a parent, I find that a hard command. Like, don't exasperate your children. It's like, I feel like I do that sometimes. So don't exasperate them. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. What Paul's essentially saying here is just simply that we have a sacred responsibility to raise our children. Now, for some of us, we had parents who did not see their responsibility to raise us as a sacred responsibility. For some of us, if we look in the rearview mirror at our childhood, we recall interactions with our parents where they were far more concerned about themselves than they were us. For some of us, we recall that parent with an addiction or a dependency, or we recall that parent that to earn their love, we had to succeed or accomplish. Or we recall being treated unfairly compared to some of our siblings. Or we recall being a part of a family where there are certain things that we don't talk about. There are certain things that we don't bring up. There are some topics that are off limits, and we don't actually want to be honest about how we're emotionally feeling. So we grew up as children recognizing there are some things that are safe to say to my parents, but there are some things that are really not safe to say to my parents. And so we just kind of turned that part of us off, or we turned it way, way down. And then as we became adults, we just kind of kept the volume on those things off. And so we struggled to connect with others because we struggled to be vulnerable. For many of us, when we look back at our families of origin, we look back on a history of tragedy. And to recognize then that there is a sacred responsibility to raise our children. We can't guarantee how that will end. A godly home doesn't guarantee godly kids. And yet that doesn't mean that we pour any less of ourselves into the sacred responsibility, because what we recognize, especially if you came from a home where your parents did not take it as a sacred responsibility, we recognize that there are repercussions for not holding it like that last year after year, and in some cases, generation after generation. The way that we love others or withhold love from others oftentimes will teach them how to love or withhold love from others as well. And it's a wound that just gets passed down from person to person and generation to generation. Here's the other thing. If you came from that kind of home and that kind of background, I don't know if anyone has said this to you before, but I want to say it. I'm so sorry. And that wasn't fair. And no one deserves that. I also want you to hear me to say that unfortunately, an enormous burden of responsibility has been placed on your shoulders because of the failures of your parents to break that cycle and to choose to live your life in a different way than the people who raised you chose to live theirs. It's not fair that you have to carry that weight. But if you want your life to be different, and the lives of those who are within your inner circle to be different than your life was growing up, that's the weight you must carry. And then carrying that is a part of your sacred responsibility. Parents, we must embrace the responsibility and release the outcome. You embrace the sacred responsibility regardless of how you were raised, regardless of what your parents did for you or didn't do for you. You embrace the responsibility, but then you release the outcome because you just recognize, look, I'm not promised that a particular investment in my kids, of doing everything, I'm not promised that that will mean that they are godly. That's not what the scriptures teach. But what Paul urges you to do is to take up this sacred responsibility to be there for your kids in hopes that what you invest into them, they will invest into others later. When I was 16 years old, I had just gotten my driver's license, and my dad was driving home. He was about 3 miles from our house, and he ran out of gasoline. My dad often liked to play chicken with the gas gauge, and sometimes he lost. So he called my mom, and he's like, hey, can you get Josh to bring a gas canister here and fill up the car and bring it home? And, she gave him a hard time, obviously, but then sent me on my way. Now, we had this long driveway, and there was this tree that was way too close to the driveway, and my dad had been saying he was going to cut it down for years, but if you kind of took it slow and you made your way past it, you could squeeze by, and so he just hadn't. And I jump into our van. It was a massive van. I had not driven it a whole lot up till this point, and I start driving down the driveway, and I'm going kind of fast because I don't want my dad to have to wait for me, and I hit the side mirror on the tree, and the side mirror, I hit it with such force that it knocked into the window, and the window, my driver's side window just sprayed all over me, got glass everywhere. And I just started almost hyperventilating, like, oh my gosh, my dad is gonna be so mad at me. I mean, it's totally his fault for not cutting that tree down yet, but like he is gonna be so upset with me. So I'm driving there, it's just a couple of miles, and I'm just thinking the whole way, like, oh my gosh, I'm so humiliated, I'm so embarrassed, he's not gonna let me drive again, probably he's gonna be so mad. And I get out of the car, and I'm almost in tears because I'm so afraid of what he's gonna say. And I'm like, Dad, I'm so sorry. I hit that tree with the mirror, and then the window exploded, and it's running. I'm really sorry. I really didn't mean to. I'll do better later. I'll try to do it. And he said, Josh. It's just stuff. Are you okay? Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. Okay, well, good. That's what I care about. Son, that's just stuff. Stuff's replaceable. Last week, I'm upstairs, getting ready to go to work. I hear a giant explosion of glass in my kitchen. And I run downstairs, and my son Jack is just standing at the table with huge eyes looking at me. And he says, Dad, I'm so sorry. I was trying to do a craft here on the table, and I pushed some stuff off. I didn't know there was a plate, and it smashed on the ground, and I didn't mean to, and I'll clean it up. And I was like, Jack, and I heard myself say, it's just stuff. Are you okay? Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. Okay, bud. Hey, bud, stuff is replaceable. Walk over there. I'll clean it up. Please be more careful next time. It's not a guarantee, but sometimes what we invest into our kids when they are 16 years old comes out of their mouth when they're 39. And so it's a responsibility to be taken up, a sacred responsibility to be taken seriously, and an outcome to be released. So whether you are a parent or not, you just need to know there is so much in life that you are told to hold as a sacred responsibility that you do not get to control the outcome of. You invest what you can, you honor God with the way that you approach it, and then you release the outcome because you don't get to decide that. And my hope today is that we will be able to invest what God has called us to invest in, and then surrender it. Surrender it to Him and allow Him to be the Lord of the results.